Chapter 1: The Woman of Letters. Paris, 1890. The city hummed with the energy of a world on the brink of transformation. The boulevards bustled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the scent of fresh bread wafted from boulangeries, and the Seine reflected the golden glow of gas lamps flickering in the night. In the heart of this ever-changing metropolis, nestled between a hat-maker's boutique and a modest café, stood a small bookstore named Librairie Montaigne, a sanctuary for lovers of literature, thinkers, and those who sought solace in the quiet whisper of pages turning. Élodie Laurent had called this place home for the better part of a decade. The scent of ink and parchment clung to her like a second skin, the rustling of books a symphony she had long since memorized. She was not merely a bookseller, but a curator of words, a gatekeeper to other worlds. By day, she arranged shelves, recommended novels to hesitant readers, and engaged in spirited discussions with intellectuals who found refuge among the store's well-worn wooden shelves. By night, under the dim glow of an oil lamp in the small apartment above the store, she translated works of literature and philosophy, bringing voices from distant lands into the realm of French prose. To many, Élodie was an enigma. In a time when women were expected to marry young and devote themselves to domestic life, she had chosen independence. It was not for lack of beauty. Her chestnut hair, often pinned loosely at her nape, framed a face of quiet elegance, and her eyes, a deep hazel, carried the weight of untold stories. Nor was it for lack of opportunity. She had suitors, men who admired her wit as much as her delicate features. Yet, none had ever captured her heart. Her greatest love was the written word, and it was through ink and paper that she found the most profound companionship. Despite her passion for translating tales of grand romance, Élodie herself had never known love, not in the way books described it. She had read of love that defied kingdoms, that endured the ravages of time, that burned brighter than the stars. Yet, she had only ever been a spectator, a translator of sentiments that had never been her own. She told herself she did not long for it, that she was content with the company of books and the musings of poets who had loved and lost. And yet, on quiet nights, when her fingers lingered over the closing line of a translated page, she sometimes wondered, what would it be like to be the heroine of her own story? One evening, as the sky over Paris turned to shades of lavender and gold, Élodie stood by the bookstore's front window, watching the city move through its endless dance. She had just finished translating a passage from Dante's Vita Nuova, a work so deeply steeped in longing that it had left her unsettled. The streets were alive with motion, couples strolling arm in arm, carriages rattling over cobblestone, street vendors calling out their wares. Life was unfolding in every direction, and yet, she remained within the confines of her bookstore, untouched by it all. It was then that the bell above the door chimed, snapping her from her thoughts. A postman stepped inside, shaking the raindrops from his cap before holding out a single envelope. "For you, mademoiselle." She frowned, wiping her ink-stained hands on her apron before accepting the letter. She was not expecting correspondence, and the handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, bold yet elegant, the strokes deliberate. She turned it over and saw that the seal was unbroken. Something about it made her pulse quicken, though she could not have said why. She moved to the back of the store, where a wooden desk sat beneath a shelf lined with half-burnt candles and scattered manuscripts. Carefully, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The words within were not meant for her. "Dearest Marianne, I write to you not knowing if this letter will find its way to your hands or if it will be swallowed by the silence that has separated us for too long. I do not know if you have forgotten me or if you have chosen not to reply. But I must write, for my heart knows no other recourse. Each day without you is a day half-lived, and though I tell myself I must move on, I remain tethered to the memory of you. If you have found happiness elsewhere, say only the word, and I shall trouble you no longer. But if, by some miracle, you still think of me as I think of you, then let me hope, let me believe that not all is lost. Yours eternally, Gabriel Moreau. Élodie exhaled slowly, as though she had been holding her breath for the entirety of the letter. She read it again, and then once more, drawn into the depth of its emotion, the quiet desperation between the lines. It was intimate, raw, meant only for the eyes of a woman named Marianne. And yet, it had found its way to her instead. A strange sensation bloomed within her chest, something foreign, something akin to yearning. She had spent years translating love letters of centuries past, yet never had she held one that still pulsed with the immediacy of an unclosed chapter. Who was Gabriel Moreau? And who was Marianne, the woman whose silence had left him in such anguish? She should return it, of course. It was the proper thing to do. Yet, even as she thought it, her fingers hesitated over the parchment. She traced the loops of his signature, the way the ink bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. It was a window into a stranger's soul, and she had been granted the key. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, pattering softly against the glass panes of the bookstore. The city moved on, unbothered, but within the quiet sanctuary of Librairie Montaigne, Élodie Laurent's world had shifted. For the first time, her life no longer felt confined to the pages of books. She had unwittingly stepped into a story of her own. And it had begun with a lost letter. Chapter 2, A Stranger's Words. The rain had ceased by the time Élodie closed the bookstore for the evening, but the scent of damp earth and freshly fallen water lingered in the air. The letter from Gabriel Moreau weighed in her palm, the inked words burning themselves into her thoughts as she climbed the narrow wooden staircase to her apartment above Librairie Montaigne. She had carried the letter with her all day, unable to part from it. She told herself it was mere curiosity, that as a translator and lover of words, she was naturally drawn to the eloquence of the confession within. But deep down, something about Gabriel's plea spoke to her in a way no book ever had. His longing, his vulnerability, these were not the poetic musings of a fictional lover, but the raw sentiments of a real man who had dared to put his heart to paper. By the glow of a single oil lamp, Élodie read the letter once more, tracing the lines with the tips of her fingers. She pictured him as he wrote, hunched over his desk in Lyon, his pen scratching furiously across the page, hope and uncertainty guiding his hand. She imagined Marianne, the woman he had written to. Where was she now? Did she still think of him? Or had she deliberately chosen silence? She sighed, leaning back against the worn wooden chair, the letter trembling between her fingers. She knew what she ought to do. The proper course of action was clear: return the letter to its rightful recipient. It had been a simple mistake, an envelope misplaced by a distracted postman. It was not hers to keep. And yet, a quiet war raged within her. How often had she translated letters of longing and devotion from centuries past, marveling at the courage it took to pour one's soul onto paper. She had always admired such bravery, yet she had never known what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such words. For all her knowledge of literature and philosophy, love had remained a distant, untouchable thing, confined to pages she could read but never live. This letter had fallen into her hands as if by fate. Could she truly let it go without a second thought? Her gaze drifted to her writing desk, where stacks of parchment and half-finished translations lay scattered. The candle beside her flickered, casting elongated shadows across the room. Without allowing herself further hesitation, she reached for a blank sheet of paper and dipped her quill into ink. Her heart pounded as she pressed the nib to the parchment. Gabriel Moreau. Your words found their way to me by accident, but they have lingered in my mind long after I first read them. I do not know Marianne, nor do I know the circumstances that have kept her from replying to you. But I do know this: your letter is beautiful in its honesty, and your longing is deeply felt. Sometimes, the silence of a loved one speaks louder than words. But sometimes, silence is merely an unanswered question, waiting to be broken. Are you certain she has received your letters? If not, should love truly be abandoned without knowing for sure? Pardon the boldness of a stranger, but I could not return this letter without adding my own words. If my intrusion is unwelcome, you may disregard this note and think of me no further. Élodie Laurent. She sat back, staring at the words she had just written, her pulse racing. What had compelled her to do this? What right did she have to interfere in the life of a man she had never met? And yet, there was no regret. The moment her pen had touched the paper, she had known she could not remain silent. She could not let this letter vanish into the void without acknowledgement, not when it had stirred something so deep within her. If nothing else, she had only spoken the truth. Carefully, she folded the original letter inside a fresh envelope, slipping her own note alongside it. She addressed it to the return address printed in the corner, Gabriel Moreau, Université de Lyon, and sealed it before she could change her mind. The following morning, as dawn stretched over Paris, Élodie made her way to the post office. She hesitated for only a moment before slipping the envelope into the postman's waiting hands. It was done. The letter would find its way back to its rightful owner. But as she stepped back onto the bustling street, a strange feeling settled in her chest, one she could not quite name. A thread had been woven, a connection formed, however fleeting. Would he reply? She told herself it did not matter. And yet, as the days passed, she found herself glancing toward the mailbox with an anticipation she had never known before. Chapter 3: A Love in Ink. The envelope arrived on a crisp autumn morning, nestled among the usual mundane correspondence that Élodie collected from her mailbox. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the parchment, her heart pounding with anticipation and an emotion she could not yet name. Mademoiselle Laurent. Your letter took me by surprise, though I must confess, not an unwelcome one. In a world where so many words are spoken carelessly, yours carried a sincerity I could not ignore. You are right, sometimes silence is simply an unanswered question, waiting to be broken. I do not know if Marianne ever received my letters. I only know that she never answered them. Perhaps that is answer enough. And yet, your words have reminded me that we are not always meant to let things slip into the void so easily. Tell me, Élodie Laurent, how does a woman of such perceptive thought spend her days? What books lie open on your desk? What words linger in your mind long after you close their pages? Gabriel Moreau. A warmth spread through her as she read his words, and before she could overthink, she reached for her pen. It was the beginning of something she did not yet understand, but she could not stop herself from writing back. What followed was a correspondence unlike anything Élodie had ever known. What had started as a simple exchange of thought soon transformed into something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. They wrote of everything and nothing, of literature, of philosophy, of the changing world around them. Gabriel mused about his days in Lyon, the university halls where he lectured, the students who filled them with youthful energy. Élodie painted vivid pictures of Paris, the scent of bread from the boulangeries at dawn, the murmur of voices in the bookstore where she worked, the solitude of translation in the quiet hours of the night. Their words became their world. Every letter was an unveiling, peeling back layers neither had shown to anyone before. They bared their souls in ink, revealing their fears, their dreams, their regrets. Gabriel confided in her about his childhood, the loneliness of growing up in a family that valued pragmatism over poetry. He spoke of how he had once dreamed of becoming a writer, only to be steered toward academia, a safer, more sensible path. Élodie, in turn, revealed the secret heartache she had carried for years, the isolation that came with being a woman who lived for words, who refused to be defined by marriage or convention. She spoke of the suitors who had come and gone, each of them expecting her to be someone she was not, someone smaller, more willing to bend. "I sometimes think I was born in the wrong time," she confessed in one letter. "As though I were meant to live in the stories I translate, rather than in the world outside my window." His response came swiftly, filled with a kind of urgency. "Or perhaps you were born precisely when you were meant to be, Élodie. Perhaps it is the world that is slow to catch up to you." She read those words over and over, as if they contained a truth she had been waiting her whole life to hear. As the weeks turned to months, she found herself measuring time not by the days on the calendar, but by the rhythm of their letters. The arrival of his envelopes became the highlight of her days, the promise of his word something she clung to even in the quietest moments. And yet, beneath the joy, a question loomed, unspoken but ever present: could love truly flourish through ink and paper alone? Could one fall in love with a mind before ever seeing the face it belonged to? Late one evening, by the light of a flickering candle, she held his latest letter against her chest, breathing in the faint scent of parchment and ink. Her heart knew the answer before her mind dared to form the words. She was already falling. Chapter 4: The Risks of the Heart. The letter lay unopened on Élodie's writing desk, its edges slightly curled from days of neglect. She had read Gabriel's previous letters with a hunger she could not explain, but this one, with its simple yet daring proposal, filled her with a trepidation she could not shake. He wanted to meet. After months of letters, after bearing their souls through ink and parchment, he wished to see her, to step beyond the world of words and into something tangible, something real. For days, she resisted the urge to open it again, but the weight of its presence pressed upon her, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. What if reality shattered the fragile beauty of what they had built? What if the man she had come to know so intimately through his words was not the same in person? Worse still, what if she disappointed him? She had always been comfortable in the shadows of her books, in the solitude of translation, where emotions could be expressed without consequence. Yet now, faced with the prospect of stepping into the light, she hesitated. She found herself avoiding his letters, fearing the pressure of his expectation, fearing what she might lose if she took this step and it all crumbled beneath the weight of reality. Weeks passed in silence. Each day that went by without her responding felt like a betrayal, but she could not bring herself to pick up her pen. The thought of him waiting for her reply filled her with guilt, and yet, she convinced herself it was for the best. If she did not respond, the moment would pass, the risk would fade, and she could remain in the safety of her carefully constructed world. But the silence was unbearable. One evening, after closing the bookstore, she wandered the streets of Paris, hoping the cold autumn air would still the storm raging inside her. The gas lamps flickered, casting golden pools of light upon the cobbled streets, and in the distance she heard the faint notes of a violin from an open window. The city, ever vibrant, seemed indifferent to her turmoil. It was then that she realized she had made a mistake. Her life had always been shaped by words, by the safety of ink and paper, but had she not longed for something more? In Gabriel, she had found a connection unlike any she had known, a meeting of minds so rare it felt almost unreal. And yet, she had been willing to let it slip away out of fear. The next morning, with hands trembling from the weight of her decision, she wrote her reply. Gabriel, forgive my silence. It was not a lack of feeling that kept me from writing, but the opposite. I have been afraid that what we have built is too fragile to exist beyond the written word, afraid that I will disappoint you or that the magic we share will vanish the moment we stand face to face. But I have come to understand that fear is no reason to walk away from something rare and beautiful. If you still wish to meet, I will be there. Beneath the clock at Gare de Lyon. Midnight. Élodie. As she sealed the letter, a new kind of anticipation settled within her, not just fear, but hope, a trembling excitement that set her heart racing. The risk had been taken. There was no turning back now. Chapter 5: A Meeting at Midnight. The night air was crisp, carrying with it the distant murmur of the city that never truly slept. Gare de Lyon loomed before Élodie, its grand facade bathed in the glow of gas lamps, the great clock above ticking toward the fateful hour. She stood beneath its gaze, her breath unsteady, her heart waging a battle between anticipation and fear. Midnight was moments away. Her gloved fingers tightened around the folds of her cloak, seeking some sense of steadiness, but it eluded her. How many times had she imagined this moment? 1,000 different versions played through her mind, yet none could prepare her for the reality that awaited. Would he recognize her? Would she recognize him? Would the magic of their letters survive this leap into the tangible world? The station was quieter at this hour, save for the occasional traveler passing through. A train whistled in the distance, its echo stretching through the vast space. Élodie's pulse quickened. And then, as the clock's hand struck 12, she saw him. A man stepped forward from the shadows, his movement slow, almost hesitant. Gabriel. For a fleeting moment, she felt the urge to turn away, to retreat into the safety of written words, where emotions could be crafted and controlled. But then their eyes met, and the world around them faded. He was neither exactly as she had imagined, nor entirely different. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges, unruly despite his best efforts, and his eyes, deep and contemplative, held the weight of all the letters they had exchanged. There was something familiar in the way he carried himself, in the slight tilt of his head as he studied her, as though searching for the Élodie he had come to know through ink and paper. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. It was Gabriel who finally broke the silence. Élodie? Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and yet it felt as if they had spoken for years. She nodded. Gabriel. A small, relieved smile crossed his face. You are real. She let out a soft, breathless laugh. So are you. There was a pause, brief but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, as though instinctively, they began to walk. Out of the station, into the streets of Paris, where the glow of lanterns cast long shadows and the quiet hum of the Seine provided a melody to their first meeting. Their conversation was careful at first, like tentative brushstrokes on an unpainted canvas. They spoke of the journey, of the cold night air, of the familiar strangeness of standing beside one another. But soon, the letters, the words they had woven over months, found their way into speech, and the distance between them disappeared. I was afraid, Élodie admitted as they crossed a quiet bridge over the river. Afraid that meeting in person would ruin what we had. That reality could never match the poetry of our letters. Gabriel nodded slowly. I feared the same. But now, standing here, I realize something. What? He turned to her, his gaze steady. Words do not create love. They only reveal it. And love, real love, does not dissolve when ink meets air. She swallowed, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within her. Perhaps she had always known it, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way she had never dared to believe. As the night stretched on, they wandered through the labyrinth of Parisian streets, losing themselves in conversation, in laughter, in shared silence. The city, so familiar to Élodie, felt new with Gabriel beside her. The bridges, the narrow alleyways, the quiet cafes, they all bore witness to the unfolding of something rare and precious. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, they found themselves near the bookstore where Élodie spent her days. She hesitated at the doorstep, the reality of morning creeping in. This night had been theirs, untouched by the world beyond. What would happen when daylight intruded? Gabriel, as if sensing her thoughts, reached for her hand. Let us not worry about tomorrow just yet. Let us hold on to tonight a little longer. And so they did. In the hush of early morning, in the quietude of a city on the verge of waking, Élodie Laurent and Gabriel Moreau lingered in the moment, knowing that something extraordinary had begun. Chapter 6: A Trial of Fate. For a brief, luminous moment, Élodie and Gabriel lived within a world of their own making, a world crafted through letters, sealed with longing, and now brought to life by stolen evenings and whispered conversations in Parisian streets. They had found in each other a rare kind of companionship, one that flourished in both ink and presence. But as the days passed, reality, relentless and indifferent, pressed its weight upon them. The letter arrived in late autumn, its contents as sharp as the chill in the air. Gabriel had been offered a position to teach at a prestigious university in Vienna, a dream he had once shared with Élodie in their correspondence, a future that now stood before him like an open door. It was an honor, a recognition of his intellect and passion, a chance to shape young minds in a city that had long called to him. Yet, the exhilaration of it was dampened by a singular, heart-breaking truth. Accepting it meant leaving Élodie behind. He found her in the bookstore, where she had first received his letter all those months ago. The same place where words had brought them together would now bear witness to the most difficult conversation of their lives. I leave in 2 weeks, he told her, his voice quiet but steady. I don't want to go without you. Élodie inhaled sharply. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come, that the world beyond their love would eventually demand its due. Yet, knowing had not prepared her for the ache in her chest. Vienna, she murmured, testing the name on her tongue as if she could make it familiar, make it hers. You always spoke of it with such longing. I did, he admitted. But that was before you. The bookstore was empty except for them, the scent of paper and ink mingling with the fading light of day. She turned away, running her fingers over the worn edges of a book on the counter. If she went with him, she would be leaving behind the life she had built, her work, her city, the little sanctuary of books that had shaped her world. But if she stayed, she would be letting him go. I don't know if I can leave, Gabriel, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Paris is my home. He stepped closer, his presence warm despite the cold weight of their predicament. And you are mine. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with all the words they did not know how to say. They had always spoken best through letters, but there were no ink and parchment here, only raw emotion and the cruel march of time. That night, they walked the streets of Paris one last time as lovers unbroken by distance. They wandered without direction, tracing old paths and discovering new ones, holding on to fleeting moments as if they could bottle them against the inevitable dawn. By the river, where the water reflected the glow of street lamps, Gabriel stopped. Tell me to stay, Élodie, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. Say the word, and I will. Her heart twisted. She wanted to say it, to keep him here, to anchor him to her world. But she knew she could not. He had worked too hard, dreamed too long. To ask him to stay would be to ask him to abandon a part of himself, and she loved him too much to do that. Instead, she reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. I would never ask you to give up your dreams, she said, her eyes shining. Just promise me we won't lose each other. He kissed her then, not with desperation, but with devotion, with the quiet certainty that what they had would not fade with miles. We will write, he vowed. No matter the distance, no matter the years. Our words will find their way. They parted at dawn, at the very station where they had first met. Gabriel boarded the train bound for Vienna, and Élodie stood on the platform, her hands clasped tightly, holding onto the promise they had made. As the train pulled away, taking him farther and farther from her, she whispered to herself the words she had not been brave enough to say aloud, I love you. The city felt different that morning, emptier, quieter. But as she walked back through the streets of Paris, she clung to the belief that love, once found, could not so easily be lost. And so, she waited for his first letter, knowing it would come, knowing their story was not yet over. Chapter 7, The Lost Letter. The days turned to weeks, the weeks into months, and still, no letter arrived. At first, Élodie told herself there was an explanation, perhaps the post was delayed, or perhaps Gabriel had been too consumed with settling into his new life in Vienna. But as the months stretched into a year, and then another, silence became her only reply. She continued writing to him, each letter filled with longing, news of her life, and questions she feared would never be answered. She sent them faithfully, week after week, until the ink of her hope began to fade. In the quiet solitude of her bookstore, she threw herself into her work, losing herself in the endless translations of stories not her own. Words had once been her sanctuary, but now they became her refuge, a place where she could exist without facing the emptiness Gabriel's absence had left behind. She convinced herself he had moved on, that he had been caught up in the grand possibilities of Vienna and forgotten the woman he had left behind in Paris. And yet, forgetting was something Élodie could never do. His memory lived in every quiet moment, in the rustling of pages, in the distant sound of a train whistle, in the way autumn leaves danced through the streets. She wondered, at times, if she had imagined it all, if the love they had built through ink and words had ever truly existed beyond paper. The world moved forward, and so did she, at least on the surface. But deep inside, she remained suspended in time, waiting for a letter that never came. Years passed, and Élodie grew accustomed to the quiet ache that settled in her chest. She learned to live with it, the way one learns to live with a faded scar. Life had not been unkind to her. She had her bookstore, her work, a quiet contentment. And yet, there were moments, late at night, when she would sit by her window and imagine a life where things had been different. A life where the letter had come. A life where she had gone to Vienna. One afternoon, as she dusted the old shelves of her bookstore, her hand brushed against something wedged in the back of a wooden drawer, an envelope, yellowed with time, hidden between the pages of an old novel. Her heart pounded as she pulled it free, fingers trembling as she turned it over. Her name was written across it in familiar, elegant script. Gabriel. She sank into a chair, the world tilting around her as she carefully broke the seal. The letter inside was worn, the ink slightly smudged with age, but his words were as clear as if they had been written yesterday. My dearest Élodie, I do not know if this letter will ever find you, but I must write it all the same. I have written to you many times, but I fear my words are lost in the void. I do not know if you have stopped writing to me, or if fate is simply cruel, but I can no longer bear the silence. Did you ever receive my letters? Did you read my words and decide to let me go? Or have you, too, been waiting? I have waited for you, Élodie. I have waited for years, believing, hoping, that you would come. That one day, I would turn and find you standing in Vienna, your eyes filled with the same longing I carry within me. But I cannot wait forever. If you do not come, I will understand. But know this, I have loved you in every letter, in every unspoken word. And I always will. Gabriel. The letter slipped from her hands, her breath caught in her throat. She had never received his letters. And he had never received hers. The truth struck her like a cruel wind. Gabriel had waited for her, just as she had waited for him. They had both been trapped in the same silence, believing themselves forgotten when, in reality, they had never let each other go. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. How different her life could have been. How many years had been lost to fate's cruel hand? She thought of Gabriel in Vienna, of the love they had shared in words, of the life that had been stolen from them by something as simple as a misplaced letter. But as grief threatened to consume her, something steadier took its place, a quiet understanding. Love, once given, was never truly lost. It had shaped her, carried her through the years, even when she had believed herself alone. And in some way, it had remained eternal. Élodie pressed the letter to her lips, a silent farewell to the life they had never lived. And then, with a deep breath, she placed it gently in a box with her other letters, the one she had written to him but never sent, the pieces of a love story that had existed beyond time. Outside, the streets of Paris carried on, indifferent to the past. But within her, something had shifted. She would carry Gabriel's love with her always, not as a burden, but as a testament to the power of words, of love, of the unseen threads that connected souls across time and distance. And as she stepped into the golden light of the afternoon, she knew she was ready to turn the page.